So let's work on the validation of this form, because at the moment we can submit it without entering anything, and that's of course not the idea behind this form. So in the coach form component here, we're fetching the input, but now I want to add an extra step when we submit the form. I also want to validate it. And for that, I'll add a separate method, validate form, simply to split the logic in two methods and not have one super long method. And in submit form, right at the start, I'll simply call this validate form. So this new method which we're adding here. Now in here, I want to go through all the inputs and check whether they are valid or not. And I will add an overall new data property here to this entire component, the form is valid data component, which initially is true, but which will be false as soon as one input is false. Now actually, I'll make form validation even a bit more complex than just that. I also want to manage the validity of every single element so that I can later really highlight the elements, by coloring the label red, for example, that were invalid. Therefore, the other data which is managed here is no longer just the value of a certain property, but instead here, that will be an object now, where I want to have a val key, which holds the value the user entered, and a isValid key, which initially is true, which can become false if that input should be invalid. So I'm going to replace my values here with that new concept. Here val is null initially, and here it's an empty array initially. So now the data got a little bit more complex, and now we need to update vModel and bind this to firstname.val, lastname.val, and so on, because now first name, last name description actually hold objects where we have a val property, which then holds the value that should be bound. So that's why I'm updating my vModel bindings for all the inputs here, including the checkboxes, of course, like this. And now with that, in our validate form method, I will go through all these inputs, have a look at each of them, and see whether it's valid or not. For this, initially, I'll set this form is valid to true, in case it got invalid and therefore false in between since the last validation. And then I'll go through all these inputs. The first one I'll check is the first name. Here with an if statement, I'll check if the value is empty. Keep in mind we're trimming it already, so therefore excess whitespace will already have been removed. If it's still empty, it's invalid, and therefore then I would set this first name is valid to false. And since the overall form is invalid, if at least one input is invalid, I'll set this form is valid to false here. And then we can repeat this for the last name and set this last name is valid to false here. And again, repeat it for the description and set this description is valid to false. Now for the rate, the check is a bit different. Here I'll not check whether it's empty, but I'll check if we don't have a rate, so if it's null or 0 or anything like that. Or even if we do have a rate, I'll check if this rate val is smaller than 0, because you shouldn't be able to have a negative hourly rate, of course. So in these cases, rate is valid would become false. And for the areas, I'll check if this areas val length is equal to 0, which means no areas of expertise have been added. That's also not valid. You need at least one area. So in this case, this areas is valid would become false, and this form is valid would become false. So that's my validation logic. That means that after calling this validate form, this form is valid will be false if the form is invalid. So therefore in submit form, I can check if not this form is valid. And in this case, just return to make sure that the rest of this method doesn't execute, because I don't want to continue if the form is invalid. And now we can go to our template and actually show the user some feedback if inputs or the overall form are invalid. Let's start with the overall form maybe. For that, before the base button, I'll add a paragraph where I say, please fix the above errors and submit again, or anything like that. And we only show this with the if not, form is valid. So if the form is invalid. If form is valid is false. But that's not all. Instead, I also want to highlight the inputs that were invalid. So let's start with the first name. There, on the overall div, I'll bind a class dynamically. And I'll use this object syntax for that. And here I want to add the invalid class, which is defined down there in the CSS rules to then change the label color and so on. I want to add that invalid class here on first name if not first name is valid. If it is invalid, therefore. Then this invalid CSS class will be added to this div. In addition, below the input, I'll have a paragraph where I say first name must not be empty. And this is shown if not first name is valid. Now I'm going to copy that paragraph because for last name I want to say the name just with last name and check if last name is not valid. And I will also copy that class assignment and assign it on this div as well, but of course checking last name is valid, or it not being valid to be precise. Now for the text area, for the description, it's the same. Copy the paragraph and say description must not be empty, and also copy this CSS class assignment to the div by checking description is valid. And again, copy the paragraph over to the rate. And here I of course want to say rate must be greater than 0. And also add the CSS class here to the div if rate is not valid. Copy the paragraph again and go down to the checkboxes. And here below all checkboxes, I'll also add this paragraph and say, say at least one expertise must be selected. And of course show this if areas are not valid. I forgot this on the other paragraphs. Here I should check if rate is not valid. Here if description is not valid. And I did update it for first and last name. But also now copy that class here and add it on that form control div around the checkboxes if areas are not valid. With that, we hopefully have some validation. If I now reload and submit the empty form, everything is red. We got these error messages and we got this main form error message. If I reload again and I do enter something here and here, but I have a negative rate here, for example, only the invalid values are marked as such. And of course, if we enter something valid in all the fields, we are able to submit this. But of course, we get an error because at the moment, I'm still not extracting the values correctly in my form data. That's something we'll fix later. Before we fix that, there's one other thing I want to fix. If this is invalid, it would maybe be nice if it wouldn't stay red after we entered a valid value here. It's a minor thing, but I think it's a better user experience if as soon as this was fixed, this would go away, this red color and this error text. And therefore, that's a functionality I also want to add here. For that, we can add a new method, clear validity, or anything like that, and expect to get the input name here as an argument, and then reach out to this input, so to a data property, first name, last name, description, and so on, of that input's value. So if input is first name, we'll reach out to this first name. If this is last name, we'll reach out to this last name. and set isValid of that input to true. And clear validity should be called whenever an input loses focus. And for that, on every input element in HTML, we got the blur event. It's a built-in event which is triggered whenever, well, this loses focus. That's when I want to call clear validity, and in this case, forward first name, because that's for the first name input. But now repeat this also on the last name here, also on the text area. Here it's description, and also repeat this on the rate. And then of course also on the checkboxes. So on every checkbox element, I'll clear areas. Whoops. Copy that to all the checkbox inputs. Reformat this to make it a bit easier to read. And with this, if we now save this, if I submit the invalid form, it's all red. But if I enter a valid name, that becomes black. This is a test. If I enter something invalid, it also becomes black because we have to validate again. But at least it recognizes that we did something. And when I blurred something here, it also becomes black. Now, of course, if I do have an invalid input here, we still get an error, but at least we give the user the feedback that we see that he or she changed something. With that, though, we got validation in place, and I'm happy with that. Now I just want to make sure data is submitted correctly. And for that, here in the submit form method, we need to drill into the val properties of all our input properties, because that is where we store the concrete values. With that though, if we reload, if I have something invalid, we get an error. But if I do enter valid values here, like this is submittable, and we see our code here. So that's all working. As a next step, we can move on to the requests feature and make sure that we got a contact form, and that when we do use that contact form, we send a request, which then also shows up here under requests.